It did not make.
Okay, cool. Right. So, hi everyone. My name is Imran, and I will be giving a workshop on how do you sell an identity argument to someone who isn't part of that identity. Um, so I was asked to do this specific workshop. Um, no- uh, and I think this is something that's a very cool thing to think about because I think we are in an era of debating where it is very giving five reasons to why something is true. Uh, and that is not necessary. While that isn't necessarily a problem, well, whether or not it's a problem is something that is up for interpretation. But regardless, that is the way that we are in now. And it's become very homogeneous. And what I mean by homogeneous is that the way we present or argue certain cases has broadly transitioned or shifted towards a objectively, universally, quote unquote, correct way of selling an argument, including things which are non tangible or something that doesn't necessarily appeal to objectivity, i.e., identity. And I think in cases where you want to make sure that you sell a specific argument that is related to things like this, that it is okay to branch out and not go to that. No, you don't. That you don't need to go fully all into this kind of very technical meta, and that it is important to think about debating as a bit of an art form. And I think this is where I'll kind of just very strongly start the point, or like I guess the intro of this workshop. Debating is, to my eyes, an artistic expression in the sense where it is a subset of public speaking. And that subset of public speaking, while technically has a reduced emphasis on what needing to sell what you may call a beautiful speech is still something that is important and well recognized. And I think there's a reason why we like to hear recordings of past debatings a lot more compared to the recordings of now. Um, why do we like, why we specifically really care about wanting to make sure that there is some form of beauty in this game where we want to give speeches that we are proud of, not just because they're objectively good, i.e., we prove those speeches to the best way possible, but we said something in those speeches that we really cared about, and we were able to express that in a way which was something that we're proud of. And I think it does get a bit frustrating because I think sometimes it's like I'm running this and I ran it in a way which it mattered to me and it doesn't get credited because it was too rhetorical, which is like annoying, and I face it too. So hopefully in this like I guess you could call it a bit more of a so this the way what I'm teaching in this workshop is definitely going to not be that technical. This workshop presumes that you already do know things that such as analysis and impacting. Like you basically should be able to understand very basic debater concepts because it takes what we conventionally know as things like framing and arguments and because I guess you would say paints them in a picture of how you are able to sell these things in a way which allows for you to be able to maybe not win more, but probably just give speeches that you're really proud of. Probably just give speeches about topics such as the identity of ethics thing that you care about. Specifically about topics where you have to appeal to things which are not tangible, appeal to things which are, for the lack of a better word, um, very beautiful, or maybe it is not beautiful, but very visceral. Visceral in the sense where it connects to something that isn't purely on a utilitarian scale, but purely based on the illustration of experiences, and the illustration of the ways of life that people go through and why they care about that. And I think a huge part of why identity arguments are also important in an objective level is that it is often the precondition towards any most other cases. If you've ever heard logical a priori, identity is a massive part of what logic what of it is a massive logical a priori claim or premise that impacts or accesses a whole bunch of other things, i.e., identity is often the precondition for social justice movements and their advocacy. Identity and the care of that identity is often the precondition towards the strength of fighting against oppression or systemic marginalization. The care of identity is often the precondition towards um, the indomitable spirit of the human soul in needing to be able to push through and live, to fight for your kin, to fight for your family, to fight for the things that you care about. Um, so when we talk about identity, of course, yeah, actually, yeah. So when we talk about identity, it's something that isn't just a very vague concept. It is something that permeates all parts of who we are as people. And I think when it comes to what I want to teach, or at least show in this workshop, that having a bit of humanity and the degree of empathy when we see, and you've probably seen a lot of just the care and the huge amount of care and suffering is something that I think is important. So before we start into the real constructive parts of this workshop, some caveats. The first thing I just want to point out here is that I'm a career judge and not necessarily a career speaker. Of course, I still speak. I just speak slightly less in comparison to judging more. Um, so I think what, yeah. So I think what that means for the sake of this workshop is that yeah, I can give you advice on how to sell arguments as a speaker, but I think a lot of what I am going to say is going to be a lot more in line to making sure that you are heard by a judge. Because I am mostly a listener. And judging for more than 2 years, very competitively and very seriously, has gotten me to experience a huge diversity of different argumentation styles. And when I talk about argumentation styles, I'm mostly talking about the presentation of things such as this, the ability for you to kind of like sell things to someone who you may not know, to someone who may represent a different form of identity. Um, we often make memes about, oh God, we got the white cis man judge. And I guess you could call it that way in terms of how do you appeal to what is probably not the easiest identity to connect to. Um, that might sound racist. It might, but I think it's most just in line with the haha, haha, oh God, oh God, what if you hate me because I look a different color and etc. and things like that. Obviously, we've come at a point in debating where that's no longer a problem. Debating is very diverse. Um, what debating is very diverse. There are many different judges. We have had a very, very good rise of judges from ethnic minority, like not very well represented parts, not very well represented ethnicities who have been dominating the judging sphere. We have had far more rise of incredible judges from a diversity of like from WGM to like just yeah, all WGM spaces, very excellent people. So the whole oh no, white cis man judge will not credit me problem is not really as big as it used to be. 1,000% of times, whenever you get into a room, you're probably not going to be with a white person. You're probably going to be with someone who is like someone who probably just like does not have that. But yeah, the point that I'm trying to make here is that in those instances, even if it is someone who isn't going to be in a very extreme space of who their identity is, they're probably going to be different than you. And when they're different, you want to make sure that you are heard and judges want to hear you, and I think that's important to keep in mind. Judges still want to hear you. There's no point in time where a judge does not want to hear you unless they're a bad judge. And if you're a bad judge, then nothing in this workshop. If you're being judged by a bad judge, nothing in this workshop will apply because they're going to be bad either way, unfortunately. But in the instances where we are in the medium cases, this would still be quite valuable to make sure that you are going to appeal to a judge who may not be reflective of the identity argument you're selling. So maybe it is still a cis man, but at least it is a cis man from Asia, and you are trying to sell an argument about um, why is it that the suffering of women in, let's say, indigenous areas in South America is still something that should matter. Um, Probably, and like that's probably the best probably a median example of what this topic would apply on. The second thing to point out here is that advice that I give is not going to work 100% of the time, because judging is very subjective, and when I say judging is very subjective, that's taking out the objective lens of judging, which is the whole prove an argument, prove the likelihoods, prove why it's important, impacting, blah 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 blah. You all know these jargons already. What comes in terms of what is subjective is the kinds of ways that you like appeal and use rhetorical devices to create to make an identity argument far more compelling than it should be, because the way that style is assessed in the world's manual simply tells you that it is credited to the degree that it improves the persuasiveness of analysis, but it doesn't actually explain which kinds of subjective styles work. So you have a lot of room to think about how you want to sell something, but that also just means that different judges get appealed to different devices of rhetorics and persuasiveness in very different senses. So I think the way you quote unquote improve your odds is, of course, just by raw improving your debating skills and gaining more knowledge. But in terms of whether or not the kinds of strategies you apply to X judge, that will probably not work so much with Y judge, who comes from a different place. So you'd probably have to either cope and realize that maybe you didn't do it well, or realize that you did try to do it well, but the judge didn't understand what you were saying, which is a bit unfortunate, but that's just how it goes. Mm. Right. So, with that in mind, what is an identity argument? Uh, the literal definition is that an identity argument is when a team defends or critiques something from the lens of a particular identity or lived experience. And I think a lot of these arguments often revolve around how certain actions, policies, narratives, or just downright principles, whether it be a principle that a person goes by or a principle that appeals to what certain pieces of morality or you know non-utilitarian frameworks that we should care about. But I think the most important part to consider is how a lot of those factors impact the dignity, perception, empowerment, or lived reality of these identities. So, in short, identity argument is essentially the way that you build why you care. So firstly, it's on the identity itself and the characteristics of that identity and why that characteristic is important. I.e., um, if I am, if like it is going to be a debate about feminism, and you ask yourself, what is feminism in terms of the way that people relate to it, the way that women relate to it, and how it formulates a huge part of their life. And I think that's an important part, right? This is the first step I just want to sell here, and that I hope you guys are writing down. Identity is the biggest part of most people's lives. Maybe you don't realize it right now, and maybe you don't care much about it, but you'll often connect different parts of your identity in terms of the way that you actualize yourself as a person, whether it be through your race or your gender, or even the small locality where you come from and the community that you grew up in, and the values that those communities imparted onto you, or the ways that you lived in a specific place and developed a sense of, I don't want to say empathy, because empathy is external, but just like your life, I guess you could call it that. How it creates your life. And I think the way I would illustrate this is that identity is a book that you write to yourself that it is a bit sad because you cannot publish that book to others and they cannot read about it to understand you. but it is a book that you write to yourself, and that book represents a huge part of who you are as a person. And that book eventually decides everything that is being done. The way you choose to react to certain things, the way you the way you kind of um deal with hardship, and how the way this inspires you to do better in a specific manner, etc., and things like that. All right. So when do we run identity arguments? The list is very, very big, actually. You can run identity motions just about nearly everywhere. I'd say that I would say that the only instance, actually, no, I don't think there is an instance where you shouldn't run an identity argument. I have seen identity arguments run in IR. And it makes sense because international relations often involve concepts such as sovereignty and um, the ability to ensure that, yeah, so things like nationalism and state creation, like the ability to create states, etc. Finance and banking. Okay, maybe that's the only exception. I just realized here, you probably cannot sell an identity argument in a finance motion, unfortunately. Um, but that's not what this motion. That's not what this workshop's about. So it's not really a problem. So obviously you have the law exhaustive list of motions about minorities, disprivileged groups, social justice movements, feminism, queer rights, LGBTQ rights, trans rights, a whole lot of rights. Uh, but it doesn't just have to be feminism. It can be a whole lot of other rights. I'd say animal rights here, funnily enough, does get involved. I'd say things like indigenous rights here are very important as well. Um, Lots of rights. Media motions and representation, my personal favorite. I think this is very, very big in terms of media often shapes the way that the interpretations of identities through things like stereotypes and certain precedences that people perceive about identity mostly get perpetuated by media, i.e., media sells narratives far more harder than social norms can do. Um, and that often creates the prerequisite basis to how mostly people develop their way of life. Obviously, philosophy debates, especially when you talk about things like autonomy, especially when you talk about, yeah, I think identity is a huge part of philosophy. Law and CJS. We all heard the corrupt police, corrupt, biased criminal justice system, how the due process may not be the most, etc. Yeah, religion is part of this list. I just realized I forgot to add it. Religious identity is also something that's important, whether it be the ways that religion oppresses identity or religious identity of in itself is something that is important. The balance of your identity in regards to religion in comparison to other identities you may have, which often, of course, constructs that constructs these sets of people who have conflicting identities, i.e., for example, I am a Muslim man who cares about my family, but I also want to make sure that the rights of people who are oppressed by my religion are protected, and that creates a sense of what is the balance to achieve? Is there even a balance to even achieve? What is the resolution to the identity clash I have in terms of this? Obviously, politics. So, just to extend off of this in terms of like a little bit more on when do we run them, I think it is important to think about the way that you think about when you should run an identity argument mostly boils down to your ability to sell things which are either intangible or either something which just makes more sense in terms of the certainty of cases. Because I think when you successfully prove that the ways whether or not X affects identity or that identity is important in X context, that is often something which creates a sense of certainty or absolutism. What I mean by this is to say that when you explain and prove why a consideration of identity is important in a specific motion, it is often very easy to do the weighing to explain that this matters more because it is the most visceral point or it is the most important piece of weighing towards what the stakeholders in the debate care about. And more often than not, that is broadly true because yes, it is true that the average person probably cares about wanting to get things like welfare. The average person probably cares about wanting to get social upliftment and things like that. But like, um, if you give one oppressed person $1 million, but the trade-off was that they had to kill off all other members. Okay, maybe kill off is an extreme example. The trade-off is that they could not use that money to uplift their communities, and they had to chase. 99% of people who were given that option say no. Um, the source is that, and source, I've asked my friends this question many times, and a lot of them said, I'm sorry, but no. And the reason for that is because people, I don't like using the word irrational. I think um, irrational is a debate jargon we use to try and justify why people can't make certain choices. But realistically, I think irrationality or just non-objective thinking matters, especially because your identity is often very correlated to what we perceive as irrationality. And I hate, maybe this sounds like a bit meta and probably slightly edgy, but it's very easy to accuse someone of being irrational when they make choices that prioritize their identity because it is inherently not very utility maximizing, or it quote unquote does not make sense, i.e., why you didn't have to go ahead and um beat up a police officer. Okay, this is a very extreme example. I'm trying to think of examples. Um, oh yeah, let's talk about oppressed areas such as Iran. I think people often get questions like for like the activists there, I guess, why do you risk your life fighting for something in a regime which does not care about your identity? But they do that anyways. Like they risk themselves getting shot in the streets and getting thrown into really bad prisons because um yeah, and exactly what Wendy says. Um, this is something which is these are something which are easily perceived to be irrational choices, but they still matter. And the reason they matter a lot is because this consideration of what you choose to do as a result of the desire to protect your identity or express your identity, to protect others who share in that identity, comes from the most important part of people, which is the way that they have lived life. And that often takes precedence to even the way that they choose to care about their own life in sense of wanting to not die. Um, and I think that is why it is very important to think about why an identity argument is something we should care about, because it shapes literally everything that you do. And it shapes everything else that the people that you look at the news trying to fight for a cause do. Um, maybe not everyone is as strong of an activist as someone like, Greta Thunberg or uh, the Afghan woman. I'm so sorry. My brain is kind of slow right now. I'm sure I have the names inside. Yeah, they do this because they care, and when they care, I think that matters, and I think you should also realize that that should matter, and that is the basis for why we run identity arguments. Things can matter outside of utilitarian perspectives. Just because you are faced with the option to die does not necessarily mean that sacrificing your identity is something that is better. Um, Cultures continue to fight under oppression, i.e., um, you know, when instances of genocide by ethnic conflicts happen, the obviously there's always a constant fight, even though silence is probably convenient. So yeah, overall, this is where you run them. The easy way to think about when you run them is if we know that identity makes up a core part of a certain stakeholder's life, and we care about protecting that stakeholder, you run an identity argument about how that identity is important in the context of that motion, i.e., evaluate a specific value or a specific narrative in that motion, validates or improves the ability to express or find catharsis, or just in terms of just being able to just secure better forms of outcomes, even if it is not necessarily net benefit or net negative, etc. Some form of outcome which seems vague and intangible at first, but it is something that you care about, or whether or not the you sell these things in instances where identity is getting affected and oppressed, and you want to prove that even if X thing is risky, or even if X thing is useless, that we should give the right for people to express that identity. That that identity is something that we have no rights to say, no, you cannot express yourself because it is wrong. That we should, states have the right to, states or just any other actor in power have the right to provide a sense of protection, or proving that we must have mechanisms externally for protections of these identities to take place. And I think the easiest analogy I give here is equity policy in debating has a big section on the idea of protected attributes. The reason we have those is because we understand that the protected attributes of every debater and every participant in any debate related context is far more important, which is why when an equity violation occurs, it is always important to consider the perspective of the victim and how they felt, insofar as they felt such as a protected attribute of their identity was violated in some capacity. Yeah. So very rambly session at this part of the slide, but I think it's still very important, and I hope you guys were taking notes because I think a lot of the things that I said in this part matter. Cool. So yeah, so I think a lot of what I explained previous slide applies here. The simplest way possible is that it is the easiest way to argue in debaters of why something matters, and I've already explained why that matters. Um, and I think the issue with novice debaters is that you typically get stuck in not understanding how they can run the true potential about argument about identity, because I think we have a preconceived notion that we know what these groups would want. Like, we're debaters. They clearly want things such as, I don't know, not to die, or, they want some form of state protection, which is like true. Intuitively, yeah, that's true. But as I explained before, it's never that easy to think about. I think when you really, really step into these steps of these shoes, are you stepping into the most convenient interpretation of what you think a stakeholder acts like, or are you really trying to step into what their belief system truly is? Because if you are trying to, the first question you'll have is the lack of understanding of why people do the things they do. But the more you do it, even if it doesn't make sense to you because it clashes with your beliefs or it clashes with the way your identity is shaped, having, and this is where empathy comes into play, having empathy in understanding that the people do these things because they care about these things, I think gives them the right to do it. And I think that is something important to think about. So, um, it's important to think about, not when you are trying to step into the shoes of someone's, like of like a certain demographic's identity, expand the scope and try to really, really not just step in as a perspective of a debater, but be a person. I think, like, when I say be a person, I mean when you are, think of it as when you are, just brainstorming, that you look at this other demographic as a person you are friends with, and you're simply trying to have a conversation with them of, hey, so um what do you think about, this thing that affects your thing, and like, why do you guys do the things that you do? Obviously the easiest way to do this outside of debating is to simply just um talk to people. I like talking to people. I like talking to people and asking them about their identity and asking them why they do the things they do. And I think that's the best way to step outside of debater land. So the whole point of like the whole, novice debaters not getting stuck is that we are stuck in debater land very easily. The easiest way to get out of debater land is to step into human land. And the easiest way to understand things, to ensure that you debate much more faithfully, is to try your best to talk to people, or just follow a lot of things such as like advocacy groups, social justice movements, read a lot of things that come from read a lot of like literature that comes from activists, because the best way to understand why these things matter, especially if you're not part of that identity, is to literally expose yourself to that identity in the most like expressive, not expressive, but most like genuinity of that identity that is being expressed by the person in context. Um, this is mostly advice on just know where to read, but I think it's very important. Cool. Problem. How do we sell identity arguments when we are not part of that identity or when the judge isn't? I've already answered the first part, which is you must step outside of what is the preconceived notion of what debaters think about that identity and think a lot more about um you know things which don't make sense. Because more often than not, it is things that don't make sense which are the basis of why identity matters. I.e., example, the ability for you to rationalize that you are willing to martyr yourself for the sake of fighting for, etc. Or the rationale of being able to be a whistleblower and step out of oppression because you and it's very easy to be perceived as you're crazy and you don't talk about that life and you want to step out of that when in reality, um again, I'm going to say it again, it's very easy to paint pictures of this doesn't make sense or this is crazy because we forget that people are just trying to fight back because they care about a specific cause really hard. um so knowing that, and I think the easiest way I would say to sell it is I want you guys, whenever you think about identity arguments, even if it is not part of your identity, to think about what happens if you were genuinely in that position. And when I say this, I literally mean assume, for the sake of hypotheticals, that the exact situations that happen to Uyghur groups in China, or the exact situations that happen to Palestinians in Gaza, or any other form, such as Sudanese people and Rohingya Muslims, I want you guys to think, what would you do if it wasn't Rohingya Muslims, but it was you? It was your community and your race. You were put in that exact position. But instead of putting yourself in a position of a Rohingya Muslim, you're imagining that your own your own way of life, your culture, and your community is part of that systemic oppression, or is part of what is a genocide, or just broadly speaking, is a huge part of like that. That is, I think, when you really do try to understand why is it that people do the things they do. Because I think there are a lot of reasons to this that we can go ramble ages about that would take this workshop to 3 hours. But I think some very common conceptions of this is the idea of people are tired. People are very tired of the inability to have good faith representation or the inability to have to face preconceived notions of that identity that are not necessarily reflective, i.e., why is it that as a Muslim person I am oppressed because I am made fun of my identity because it is a race that is an identity that is associated with terrorism and oppression. Um, Maybe not the best example because unfortunately some parts of religion do perpetuate that, but there are subjective interpretations of religious identity that don't talk about wanting to do that, but just the way that it connects to our faith and makes me feel good. I think in more relevant context, in terms of things like feminism, um, a lot of people don't understand feminism, and it's very easy to make fun of feminism as things that is very too woke. It's very easy to make fun of feminism as something that, oh, you guys are just like, oh, you're just a bunch of, and I say this as an example of very misogynistic circles I've seen around, where it's very easy to say, oh, you guys are just too emotional, or you guys are just being a bit too loud here, or you guys are being too annoying. Like, ugh, ugh, ugh. Like a lot of these very easy reactions to make that are perpetuated and normalized by patriarchal norms, where, and I think all of this just boils down to the fact that complacency is a very huge part of why oppression is allowed to happen, or why, um, if it's not oppression, it is microaggression, or very strong microaggression, where people who are not part of that identity and are external to that identity, when they absorb and internalize preconceived notions of how you do this, often act as a basis for why these things happen, etc., in the first place. So things like being very easy to victim blame when someone speaks out about someone speaks out about getting assaulted or harassed, or um when preferential treatment is not given to you, or the worst part, I think, the idea that you are treated a specific way, and just because just because you're a woman. And I think like the example I use here is like the easiest example I use here is that um hold on. I'm not sure how I want to word this. Okay, it's like very easy for a guy to treat their friend who is a girl in a very specific different way, um because they see them not as a friend. I mean, obviously it is they're still friends, but they see them as like a woman. So maybe it's not necessarily oppression per se, but it's like the way I want to put it here is that it is very difficult to word this, but I say this because as someone who was a child, teenager, I think I fell victim into this where um I would befriend someone not because of who they were as some people, and I would not necessarily, maybe I did not internalize or care about them, but mostly because um I would, okay, there we go. Yeah, I figured it out. Like guys who are attracted to like someone, often when they try to get close with that someone, feel like that they are only getting closer to them for the sake of, oh, you are aesthetically attractive to me, and that is like the basis of why I choose to do with you, and not necessarily I care about you as a person and I care about who your identity is. um I the reason I bring this example out, even though it was very difficult to word it, is because the point I'm trying to make here is that we often associate specific characteristics and we treat people a specific different way just because we associate them with their identity first. But when we associate them with that identity, it often changes the way that you think about that person in a way that they may not like. So, for example, you know, maybe you want to be seen as I know, like, it's very important that we treat women in ways that they like, want, like, give them the ability to express themselves. But when it becomes a form of tokenistic representation, or when it becomes a form of like you're only doing it for the sake of you are a woman, that's not the correct way of things. Yeah. So how does this relate to the whole not part of that identity? The point here is don't generalize and don't tokenize things. It's very easy for us to argue things that, this is tokenistic and it's bad, and you should not be part of that problem when you're selling these things. Okay. So when let's now talk about the instance of when the judge isn't the problem, when the judge isn't part of the identity and you're trying to sell it to them. Um, because the first part is making sure that you are not part of the problem. The second part is trying to understand that at a point in which you are not becoming the problematic part of selling identity argument, you want to make sure that you sell the most faithful versions of when the judge is. Let's now get into that part. Uh, this is the first tip. I will spend not a lot of time on this tip because it's the most bare bones tip ever. Don't forget basics. In 80 to 90% of all instances, you literally just need to make sure you run it correctly outside of the special sauce that we'll get into tips 2 and 3. This means that you prove the premises of your case. So, if the premise of your argument is something such as, let's say, for example, um, we should afford the right to, we should afford the right of autonomy to, um, sorry, I'm trying to think, I'm just spitballing right now. I'm trying to think of like an argument that's quite relevant here to give, that I typically know how to sell. Let me just drink some water while I think about this. But going back, I think the idea behind this tip one is just to never forget the basics of debating, because even if you want to run the special sauce and you really want to think about all these important parts of identity, it's very important to maintain that you need to make sure that your basics are still there. So framing, proving your premises, impacting your case, mechanizing your links, mechanizing outcomes, etc., and things like that. Make sure your case can be credited outside of the special sauce that you use. So So, when you run things such as why we should care about why we should care about the right to protest, even in instances where, so maybe the motion is something about this house believes that social movements in oppressive regimes should try and reform the system diplomatically as opposed to maintaining violent protests. And I think the op case that would easily win this is proving that if your identity is being oppressed, you have every right to express it in the most in ways which are the most like loud, because it is the only form of ability to protect your identity without compromising it. And obviously the gov response to that is, oh, but you'll die. And then you're like, yeah, they know they might die, but they still do it anyways. Why do we afford them that right? And why do we give them that right and allow them to maintain that right to protect their identity and maintain their identity? Because the counterfactual is worse, because the concession towards your identity means that you are losing the only part of your life that matters because you're not able to express it in ways which matter to you. I.e., if you care, the women in these countries are not able to go have an education. They're not able to dress in ways that they like. They're not able to collectivize with other women and just have a normal life without the fear of being like locked into arranged marriages or getting beaten up on the streets, because it's very easy for mobs to come into that. So, the counterfactual is worse, and we give them the right to achieve this even if that is far worse off, etc., and things like that. And when you impact it, you still need to, of course, explain viscerally what happens when you don't give them that right. Um, Making sure that you prove, maybe, and you can prove the things where this right matters, regardless of whether or not it works out. Yeah, people in oppressive regimes, maybe their protests are 100% guaranteed to not work, but sometimes I think the point is never solvency. The point is just the ability and the right to do this. Um, blah 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 blah. Very basic debater stuff that I'm saying here, but I think the whole point is that please do, guys, just remember that you need to always think about debater stuff. Think about whether or not you're proving stuff. Okay, let's get on to the favorite part of my workshop, which is appeal to humanity. So, fun fact: I used to do a bit of public speaking. Very informal, but I did learn a bunch of stuff. Um, I'm guilty of arguing things in a very matter dumpy, spec heavy way without using appeal to emotion. But I think I've given some speeches where I care about a lot because of the fact that I was able to sell something in a way which wasn't conventional, but selling something in a way which I guess you could call it was something I cared about. So what are ways you can do this? Storytelling and vivid language. Um, I think storytelling is something that a lot of debaters forget how to do, or rather, they don't know how to do. Uh, Greatest storytellers include the debaters of old and some rhetorical speakers nowadays. If you've ever heard of Toby Leong, yeah, there we go. Imagine, and like, I just added a random phrase here. Imagine the hollow cry of an empty crib. There could be better phrases here, but the idea is that the way you formulate your sentences and languages and introduction and starting off with things like personal stories, anecdotes, etc., and things like that is something which is often an easy step. So I'm not trying to say sacrifice your analysis. I'm trying to say that when you're trying to illustrate or give examples to your analysis, you give it in a way which is very storytelling. And like empirically speaking, a lot of public speakers and even politicians do this where they make it very visceral and storytelling-esque because they want to sell that argument to appeal to that humanity of the person. Um, things like rhetorical questions. I was saying just now, how would you feel if you were in exposition? How would you feel where instead of the Rohingyas, it was you who was getting oppressed? It was you in a war zone where you have to escape and run away from a specific genocide. And now that you're in a safe place, you have to watch and face as the world ignores your oppression, and the world ignores etc. And when you try to speak out, you're automatically seen as just too loud or too disruptive of the status quo, or let's care about other things, yeah, or as a etc. things like that. And the analogy and using analogies is also something that's pretty important. Imagine watching a friend drown and refusing to do anything about it. Uh, imagine watching your beautiful like your beautiful Lego construction get destroyed, and the person who destroyed it said, uh, you're putting up too much space in this area. We want to keep it clean. Like, what the fuck, man? Sorry about that. So the point here is that try to think about the various amounts of rhetorical tools you can use, because I don't think debating should sacrifice rhetorics anymore. I think we should try and keep some sense of it, and I think it has worked in many instances where rhetorics have really been able to sell things quite well. Um, I think it's important to think that debating, despite being a sport, it should also be about beauty. Why do we is it that we like watching gymnasts do very very cool things, very very cool moves? Why do we like watching figure skaters do that? Because despite being a sport, a whole part of that sport is about beauty, even if there are some objective criteria to follow. Um, and that's a huge part of what makes gymnastics and ice skating and dancing, etc., and things like that, where like it all in a whole broadly appeals to that part of you, that part of you that cares and wants to see things which are very, very nice to see. Uh, and even though this might sound a little bit gaslighty, I think it is the necessary part to open up such arguments. Because the only way to understand experiences as somewhat, as a judge, to show that judge that experience, is to very, very, very clearly illustrate why that experience matters. And very, very clearly slightly gaslight them into thinking why they ought to care about that experience. Um, so the appeal to humanity often boils down to the stories that you're able to tell and the ability to be relatable and things like that. Right. Finally, description and illustration. So again, as we explained, judges are humans too. Paint them a picture. We often forget that debating is about beauty. So when you do things like framing, examples, and analogies, I think it's important to describe them in visceral detail within an equitable manner. Very important, within an equitable manner, of why the impact on identity or any form of effect towards identity is something that is important. Why is it that so I think what happens is that we'll be like, this argument is important because we need identities to be represented. The end. Seriously, dude, like don't stop there. Explain why that matters. Um, imagine being the like I think the easiest example to say is imagine seeing the black 9-year old watching The Little Mermaid and seeing that, oh my god, black actresses can do well too. And that's something which makes you really care about who you are, not just as a woman, but also as a black person, insofar as it is true to point out. And that's why arguments about role models are very important, right? And that's how you represent that the ability that your fight and your want to break that glass ceiling against all odds possible is something that is plausible and others have done it too. And this is something that's very important to make the non-tangible into the tangible. Illustration is probably the easiest skill to do thing here because it's all just about it's just about explaining or giving a nice example of why something should matter. All right. We've reached just about the 1 hour mark. I'll give 5 minutes for questions. But the conclusion to this is I don't think debating identity is about five structural reasons why representation is important. I think a lot of it is about telling the judge that the lived experiences and the memories, the way of life, the beliefs, and the activism matters outside of what we perceive to be purely utilitarian, outside what we perceive to be uh, basic claims made on catharsis, outside of what we perceive to be what is a rational decision. Because not everything needs to be rational to make sense, and not everything needs to make sense. Why do we like things which are weird? Because that's part of who we are. Uh, Even though other people find it weird, we don't think it's weird. We think it's cool. And I think nothing is ever wrong, etc. and things like that. That is why we don't tell ethnic minorities to stop fighting for your rights because you might die, because that's basically saying them you should surrender. You should surrender to the oppression. We don't tell women that they should speak out about their stories because they must maintain the peace of the status quo, because that is literally explaining that their ability to speak out for their own protection is not important. Saying that others shouldn't do that too because we ought to prioritize other things. Now, I know this sounds extreme, but it's a bit sad that it's still being done to this day. And I think as debaters, we have some form of an obligation to make sure that we do not repeat this behavior in debating as well, where we are not presuming the absolute generic ass case and we try to think about things which are to us don't make sense, but to someone else means the world to them. And I think to wrap this up, it's okay in debating to think about the sport as how human you can be. And I think humanity is something that we often forget because we think that we're being people. We think that we are trying, like, we're nice. But in reality, we often forget that a whole part of this sport is, yeah, being able to think about why things happen the way that happen, and understanding that those things can matter even if we don't fully understand them. Cool. So that's all. If you guys have any questions, you can ask me soon.
Yes, I have one.
Yeah,
So am
sure.
I
Go ahead.
audible?
You're audible, yes.
Okay. So today's lecture is pretty useful for me to apply in actor motion because so we are analyzing the actors, the identities in actors motion. But I actually believe that these methods can be applied into, like, for example, other motions. But when your opponents ask you that um, you are only talking about the minority group of people rather than considering, um, for example, the major people. So when these things happen, how will you respond to them?
So could you just repeat the question again?
So I was trying to ask that if I want to apply these methods into other motions, for example, we are talking about a majority group of people in a society, and I believe that a certain identity is pretty important in this debate. However, when I put forward the point, the opponents might say that you are only talking about a minority group of people. So in this case, how will you prove that your, for example, argument is really important?
Okay, I think the first thing to say is why should we really care about the majority? I think the first is to question whether the effect of the majority is something that is actually relevant. Because if a team is trying to say we ought to care about the most amount of people, they're often saying that because they want to say, they are more, therefore it happens. But the way you break down the logic here, um, yeah, I get what you mean. I understand what you mean. The way you break this down here is to first question whether the effect on a numerical scale is something that actually matters. So, majority groups often face the least amount of oppression, and let's talk about in politics, right? Let's say a team says we ought to cater towards the majority because they represent the things, right? But do the most people in the majority probably lived basic lives that are they do not feel a huge amount of oppression. Therefore, the change that happens when we cater to majority is not as relevant as it should be because they are not the most vulnerable groups to protect. They're often the most easiest groups to think about because they have more of them. But the way to think about it is when you do the comparison towards minorities, any policy that affects minorities, even if it is a very small thing. So let's say, for example, you give $10 to every minority group, as opposed to giving like $10 to every majority group. Which side gets the most amount of benefit? The minorities, because they are often the ones who have a higher spike of needing that change, insofar as they are the ones who are helped the most at a point in which you choose to cater them. When we cater towards majoritarian groups, and because then the weighing is a maximum amount of happiness, it's important to question whether or not the change that happens to the majority groups is something that truly matters, even if there are more of them. Um, so the point I'm trying to make here is that more change and more importance should be prioritized on minorities, not just in terms of vulnerability, but if you really want to sell it in a utilitarian maximal, a huge part about maximizing that happiness is the how much can one action improve much more net happiness as opposed to just the consideration of the numbers of people. It is also the magnitude of change that can happen when you implement a specific policy, if that makes sense. So I hope that kind of helped provide you a bit of clarity for that answer.
Yes, I get it completely. Thank you so much.
All right. Is there any other question, guys?
We have a WeChat group, so if people have questions, they can message me on WeChat and I can pass it on to Imran if speaking out on Zoom is a bit inconvenient with internet, etc., etc. So yeah. Feel free to send comments or encouragements to Imran on the WeChat group. I'll screenshot and forward to them. Cool. If no more questions in the next 5 minutes, I'll probably end the recording. Let's wait for 5 minutes for people to whip up thoughts, etc.